And next up, we have Val von Zuben.
This one. Okay, here we go. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I'm normally in my own little bubble, so it's really nice to get to know people here and to hear about all your research. I'm here presenting our research on how rainfall and temperature drive large-scale and phenologically variable body size decline in the little brown myotis. And I'm presenting on behalf of my co-authors, Hugh Broders, Tom Jung, Corey Lawson, Craig Willis, and the illustrious Christina Davy, who is a mastermind behind this project. And I want to start by with a huge thank you. Every single data point in this project was a result of someone's time, money, personal sacrifice, blood, sweat, tears. There were so many people involved in collecting the data, and some of you might even be in this room, so huge thank you. And I also want to express my gratitude for the traditional and ongoing Indigenous stewardship of the land where this work took place and where I'm speaking from today. Indigenous peoples have been protecting bats and their habitats for millennia and will continue to do so long after we're gone, so that's a positive thing. And I also want to acknowledge the generous contributions of our funding partners, so big shout out to those agencies. So as most of you know, climate change is affecting animal populations worldwide in many different ways, from altering habitats to affecting breeding success and to even changing physiology. There's been mounting evidence of body size changes in birds, fish, mammals, insects, and the magnitude and the direction of these changes is variable, and no one can seem to agree on sort of the underlying mechanism. But it's complicated, as you can imagine, and there's different ways of seeing it. It could be that climate change is putting selective pressure on certain physiological traits, or there might be a food supply issue where if there's inadequate food intake, then that might cause nutritional stress, which would affect mass and long bone growth. So for example, in polar bears, body sizes decline because of the decline in sea ice because of lack of foraging opportunities. And we've seen some support of this resource availability theory in bats recently. But it's also complicated because there's so many idiosyncrasies with different bat species. And they have the amazing ability to use daily torpor to conserve energy when times are tough. So it's a complicated question. But torpor aside, we know that avian aerial insectivore populations have declined in North America, and also some insect populations have declined. So naturally, we were curious about little browns or other bat populations to see how they're coping, possibly with a lack of food or other detrimental effects. So we started with a massive data set from the Yukon of 6,000 little brown myotis. We call this AKA bat size 1.0, and obviously we published the results under a more scientific sounding title. But we started with forearm length, so we're assessing a point in time, so the nutritional conditions at the point of development. So long bone growth tapers off as the bats get old enough to fly. So this is really like a representation of what is happening at this time on like a yearly basis. We also looked at body mass, and that's a lot more variable, fluctuates in the days or weeks up to capture. Looking at both of those things over time, we saw a decline. So for forearm length, we saw about 1 millimeter of shorter forearms over the 15-year period. And 1 millimeter doesn't seem like a lot, but it's actually biologically relevant. And I should also say that we didn't know what year these adults were born. So the decline in forearm length is actually a product of the recruitment of juveniles with shorter forearms into the population. And we also saw declines in adult body mass, but it was different for the juveniles because the juveniles that were caught earlier in the season were actually like going up in size over time. and the ones caught later were going down. And we hypothesized this might have something to do with lactation supplementation. So earlier in the season, the juveniles are being supplemented by their mothers, and then later that effect fades with time as they get old enough to forage on their own. But this kind of gave us a pause. So we sort of thought more about how energetic constraints might be different across the season. We also looked at the effects of weather on body mass, and we found that there were smaller bats after periods of rain, but bigger bats after warmer than average temperatures. And we also looked at how forearm length was linked to survival, and found that bats with longer forearms actually had a higher probability of survival. And so there's reasons for that that I could get into, but that's like another chapter in the saga, so I'll move on. So the Yukon data gave us a really good jumping off point for bat size 2.0. We had 3 objectives. We had so much data from across the country that we really wanted to see, okay, are these signs of energetic stress, declines in size, consistent across the country? So we looked at the geographic effect. And then we also wanted to see, like we were looking at with the juveniles in the Yukon, how the trends might be different throughout the season. There's so many different things happening throughout the active season. It's a tight window between the time that bats emerge in spring and then before they go back in. There's a lot happening, and so there's a lot of different variables physiologically and environmentally. So we just wanted to see if the trends in body size were different for each of these phases. And then we also wanted to look at the impacts of weather and how they also might be different in the different phases of activity. And so we followed roughly the same methods. So we used forearm length and body mass again. And this time we had 21,000 little brown myotis captures from across Canada. We added the Yukon back in, and we have Western Montane, which is interior BC, west of the Rockies, a little bit of Montana. Central Canada was southern Manitoba and northwestern Ontario. And then we have southern Maritimes in the Newfoundland region. And then this data was collected over study periods of 8 to 16 years, and this was all data collected pre-white nose syndrome. And then we brought back our weather variables again, so we had the proportion of rain days that each individual bat experienced up to capture between the beginning of the active season and the time they were captured, and then proportion of warmer than average days using the study period averages. And so we needed to define our periods of activity. We really needed a name for this, because it's not necessarily, each activity is not necessarily reproductive. Most of them are, but so we call these phenophases because they're phases in a bat's phenology, and there's different things happening in each phase for each demographic group. So it's different for adult females, adult males, juveniles, as most of you know. And then we also combined our knowledge of the what we know about the demographic groups in the regions, and we really combine that with mass changes over the season. So we use the inflection points of where the average mass changed significantly, and then drew our boundaries that way. So we classified our different phenophases for adult females. We had emergence, gestation, lactation, early swarming, late swarming. For adult males, we had emergence, summer activity, or what I like to call, what are they even doing season, early swarming, late swarming as well. And then for juveniles, it was volancy, early swarming, and late swarming. And we did this for each of the regions. So I'm going to zoom out of phenology for a second and give you the big picture results, and then I'll zoom back in. So I'm going to go through this plot just a little bit. The points and the bars represent, points are like the rates of change in the forearm length. This is adult forearm length over time. That's the predictor variable is time in this case. So any of the bars and points below the dotted line means a decrease in forearm length over time. And so you can see it's a bit of a trend, a bit of a red flag. So there looks to be energetic stress across the country. And I should reiterate that we don't know when these adults were born, so this represents recruitment of smaller juveniles. And so that naturally led us to the next question, which is, what is driving juvenile forearm length? And we did a little side analysis, and we found that on average, females in better body condition in the spring and in the previous late swarming season produced offspring that had longer forearms. So there was a connection there. And this was a carryover effect. So if there's energetic stress happening in the emergence period and in the previous late swarming period, then that's going to have an effect on the juvenile's size. But sometimes we didn't have matching cohorts of adult females and juveniles because we just didn't have that kind of data. So we kind of used proxies, so what we might think is something that would reflect the conditions at the time. So we used year again, so just focusing in on the oval there. This is juvenile forearm length over time, and we have another negative energetic trend going on. And so it's not the greatest, year is not the greatest proxy. It doesn't really tell us like what exactly is going on in terms of the conditions at the time. It could be a number of things. But we have the weather during emergence that the adult females experienced. So we have total rain, total warm. And so I want to just focus in on the other oval, which is the Yukon. And that's showing us that actually the more warmer than average days led to actually shorter juvenile forearms. And of course, everything in ecology is complicated, and so we have interactions. So we have, in terms of the central Canada and Newfoundland patterns, we have an interaction between total rain and total warm. So the effect of rain on juvenile forearm length depends on the number of warmer than average days. Okay, so I'm going to jump into the patterns in body mass between the phenophases. And this is a complicated plot. There's a lot going on. I apologize. But if you just follow the thermometer icon, you can see that it is a negative effect of the higher proportion of warmer than average days for adult females during emergence and gestation, but then that effect actually fades and it's a bit more positive during early swarming. And I've included just a regression plot there just to show you to visualize the effect. And then for precipitation, if you follow the rain cloud, rain is negative in each of the phenophases across the season for adult males. But it's really negative for males in late swarming, and you can see that pattern there. So there's differences across the season. And then, of course, we have our old pal, the interaction. So we have interactions in lactation period and late swarming. And so you can see that if you look at the solid line in the regression and interaction plot there, you can see that there's a crossover. And so it really just depends. Is it warm and dry, or is it wet and cool? So complicated. And then we have these red flags, which are the actual yearly declines. And this is negative because of the time that this is happening, they're declining over time, but at the worst possible part of the season, so during emergence, during late swarming. And these are crucial times. As we know, if the adult females are not in good condition during these times, then that has carryover effects to the juveniles. So we know some things about weather, we know some things about trends over time. We also know some things about weather trends over time, and it's getting rainier when we don't want it to be. And I connected a lot of dots across the country with like all kinds of phenophases and regions and weather patterns, and it's complicated because they don't all connect, not all the dots connect, but when we do see those connected dots, we really see some red flags. And then, of course, we have climate projections that are not very positive. So we have increases in fall precipitation, not great for those bats that are vulnerable. We also have, as you know, increase in temperature. And spring temperatures are going up, and this is also not good for those bats that are vulnerable. So kind of grim. This has implications because females that are not in good condition might forego reproduction. They might give birth too late in the season so that juveniles can't catch up. And we know from our Yukon study that bats with shorter forearms had lower odds of survival, and also lighter bats were less likely to survive white nose syndrome. That's from other studies. So really not good for population viability, and we know that bats do not need this right now. But I want to give you some good news. there's lots of little bits of good news. Warmth can be good certain times of year. Late swarming, warmth is really good for males during lactation. Warm and wet is actually good, and things might be getting better in terms of climate projections that way. And we also have other species that, from other studies, that are actually getting larger with time, so that's a positive. And there's been range expansions, and if there's warmer temperatures, bats might give birth earlier in the year, so that might also be a positive. So at least I didn't end on a terrible, sour note. So anyways, I just want to thank everyone for listening, and I hope there's time to answer questions.
Get away from the speaker with the mic. Thanks, Val. That was really great. There's definitely time for questions.
You mentioned that a lot of the biggest driver for the shorter forearms and the lighter offspring in that is sort of the mother's condition. Have we seen an amplification of these effects in recent years, like because of white nose syndrome, like lessening the condition of the mothers? Like, has that been an additional driver for this?
Yeah, Christina has done some work on maternal stress and the stress that the bats have gone through with infection and how that has carryover effects to offspring. So yeah, definitely. It's a really good question.
Because you're doing a lot of work with swarming, I was wondering if you had taken a look at how the swarming and like emerging from hibernaculate, if you had noticed like any extension of like the maternity, like the time that they're not in the hibernacula. Sorry, my question was like half-baked when I said it. So I was wondering, like, in the extension of the season they have to forage, wouldn't that mean that they have more time to get more food and maybe grow more as well? Like, have you looked at the interaction between like that time period of growth that they are getting more than the mean now because of warming temperatures in areas?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Yeah, there are obviously some benefits to a longer season. They can fatten up more, and in those adult males in the late swarming season, they do get some benefits from warming temperatures, presumably because they have longer periods of time to forage, and the weather's not as bad. But I mean, it's still rainy, but those times that they can get out might be more productive. More insects might be still active at that time.
Do you think that applies to like the northern extent of the population, like say the little brown bats in the Yukon, because their forearm size, you've said they were declining over time, but is there a way that you could account for extension of their non-hibernating season?
Yeah, I think that like I haven't looked at sort of like the extent of activity. Like I know that different years they're out longer. But I would imagine some of those folks up north would be able to say, okay, like the season is actually extended. We keep seeing bats later and later in the season.
I'm coming for you, Michelle.
I was just wondering, with the negative impacts that you're talking about earlier and the changes over time with climate, do you think there's a certain threshold where the population might just move its location, where they can't really tolerate any more in their conditions, and they may just move geographically their hibernacular, the swarming site, or something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, some species I've seen range expansions, and they might be going different directions. They might be going changing altitude. There's so much we don't know, but yeah, I would imagine that there would be some changes in terms of like where they're going, but I really don't know.
Thank you. I'm just curious if there's been any thought on if there's any correlation between artificial habitat, and I'm assuming you were looking at just naturally occurring habitat. If there's any correlation between bat recovery and health indicators, if you've seen any with artificial roofs.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question.
I didn't expect you to, though.
Yeah.
One more question? Eric has another one. Jeez, right in the ear.
Because you had data from so many different places in Canada and northern US, I was wondering if you had looked into, just because of like the density of urbanization in a lot of those places are probably like widely different, how different habitat or like landscape compositions are impacting them. So if there was during the study period, large amounts of landscape change or alteration in that area near the study sites, maybe that could have contributed to energetic demands
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
aren't like in other places.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like, we have the weather issue, but we also have other things happening on the landscape. Landscapes are changing. We've got wildfire that could be affecting size, all kinds of different things. And the weather is just like one part of that puzzle.
Do it again. Thanks, Val. Thanks very much, Val.